So good morning all, thanks for joining. We'll just give it a couple of minutes to allow everyone to join the session. Okay, I think we'll make a start. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Steve Hywood, and I'm a director and sector lead for the Building and Infrastructure Services at Bureau Veritas in the UK. So today's session will be focusing on permitted development and what the recent government stance means in relation to building regulations. Andy and Rick will lead from a technical perspective and will explore the technical details pertaining change of use, material alterations and extension provisions for residential projects, and also the acoustic considerations of this. So before we begin, I'll just run through some housekeeping. The guys will be presenting for about 45 minutes, allowing 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. This session will be recorded and the recording will be shared with you after the session. If you do have any questions throughout, then please simply add them in the Q&A box and we'll endeavour to answer those at the end. If you're experiencing some technical issues in terms of logging on or asking questions, then please let us know in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do what we can to support you. All attendees will be on mute throughout the session to avoid any disruptions as Andy and Rick present. And most importantly, we hope you enjoy the session. So today our expert speakers will be Andy Lowe, who is the Technical and Training Director for the Building Control business at Bureau Veritas, and Rick Cope, who's the Technical Director for our Acoustics business at Bureau Veritas. Andy has an impressive level of experience, having been in the field for over 35 years. His experience in the private sector is over 20 years and has allowed him to build an in-depth knowledge of both regulations and legislation surrounding building control. Rick is a technical director with over 23 years of consultancy experience, including at least 18 years specialising in the field of environmental acoustics. A corporate member of the Institute of Acoustics for over 15 years. His project experience includes preparing noise impact assessments in a variety of sectors, including residential, mixed-use planning applications. He also has provided expert witness evidence to public inquiries and appeal hearings. On that note, I'll hand over to Andy, who will kickstart the session. Over to you, Andy. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Steve, and welcome everyone to the latest webinar we're having on this very interesting subject. Government obviously very keen to ensure that the high street, as they say, is rejuvenated, especially at these very difficult times. And I just want to say I hope everyone is safe and well, and continue to be so. So this is the government's thrust to try and alleviate some of the bureaucracy in terms of planning. But whilst that is a very noble aspect, we just have to remember that the technical aspects of building control need to be adhered to. What we can't afford to have is a relaxation in the standards in terms of technical delivery, and I think that's the thrust that we are trying to unlock today, if you like. It's a very interesting aspect. There's a lot of quite complex areas to review, probably more so than the normal new builds. So you've got to navigate through it, what is required. And the first point of that really is to review what do we mean by the change of use, and where does it fit in terms of the context of building work. What we mean by building work can be sort of categorized really into a few areas. One is obviously the new build, where you build to the building regulations using the approved documents. Those approved documents, A to R, will cover the majority of scenarios for new builds, including houses and indeed commercial type buildings. Then we have a bit of a deviation when we look at change of use, and we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. Alongside that sits what's called material alterations, where you alter some of the existing constructions in buildings. And again, how that is dealt with in building control is slightly different from the new builds. And then again, we've got the little extensions, or not so little in some cases, that will pose problems. And of course, amongst all that, you might get schemes that have all of those aspects. And so it is quite difficult to be able to drive through that and to understand what you are required to do and achieve during the whole of that process for different parts of the work. So that's the overall aim of today, really, is to try and demystify some of that aspect. So firstly, we talk about material change of use. So it is clearly defined. Regulation 5 of the Building Regs 2010 gives us a heads up. It says, for instance, when you change a building's use to that of a dwelling. So if you take an office development and you change it into a dwelling, then fine. If you take a let's say Battersea power station and you take a cooling tower and you convert it into a house, not that you're likely to do that, but if you did, then again, that's a change of use to a dwelling. Similarly, when you are creating a flat or flats, then that is a change of use. Others in the list, as you can see, are changing the use to become a hotel or a boarding house, change it to become a residential institution, things like hostels, prisons, and care homes, those kind of aspects. Changing the use to become a public building, such as a library, and a public building does also include school. So if you change to a concert hall or to a school, then which a lot of people do in terms of the free schools, or often there are existing buildings that change, then it is defined as a change of use. Changing the use so that the building would no longer be exempt. This is the sort of thing where you get perhaps I don't know, let's say a generator room, or a generator building, or a transformer building, that then you take out the equipment and then you convert it. And if you convert that into a flat or whatever, then you are then required to undertake the change of use scenarios within the approved documents. If you change the number of dwellings in a building that contain at least one, so if you've got a series of houses and you convert them, then or change them, then it is a change of use. If you add a room for residential purposes, so if you've got a care home and you add another room in because you carve it up, then that's a change of use. Changing the number of rooms for residential purposes, that's just what we described. And again, if you change the use to a shop, then again, that is comes under the umbrella of change of use. Not that that's going to be very prevalent at the moment. And then the last one, which is a relatively new one, is 5K. It's just changing the use to become a relevant building under Regulation 7. So Regulation 7 talks about the ability to define flats, hospitals, and student accommodation with a floor over 18 meters. So when it comes to that, and it previously wasn't, then you are into a definition of a relevant building. So those are the criteria. The government have very nicely given us a new manual to the building regs, and I would advise people, if they get an opportunity, to download that. It's free on the MHCLG website. It's called the Manual to the Building Regs, and it gives a nice little table, which I've sort of embellished a little bit. Talks about the top row is all the types 5.1, 5A to 5K, and then what the aspects are relevant to these type of buildings. Yeah, so that's how you would go through it. So you would pick out, in some cases, for instance, means of escape applies to all of these change of uses, whereas you'll see it further down the line that some, for instance, like H2 doesn't apply to a change of use. H2 would be drainage for storm water and the like. Yeah, so there is issues with that. And again, staircases. I put staircases in garden in there. If you're not providing any and you're just leaving them what is there, that's fine, because there is no requirement to provide to upgrade or provide those staircases unless you are doing it for access, so it becomes in part of the new build area. So you don't have to do anything under a change of use. Okay, so what do I do? I just try to explain a sort of typical example, really, where we sort of converted an office into residential flats. It could easily be, and I think very pertinently at the moment, could be changing a first and second floor of a retail unit or an office unit in the high street to flats, because I think that's the thrust from the government, is to release these kind of developments. So what I thought I'd do is just run through that example. I pulled together from that table. Again, this is the on the left-hand side, the requirements for the regulations. Note, it is not everything. It is not all the regulations in what we define as Schedule 1. It's not all of A to R. Yeah, we'll see that R isn't included on that list because it's not pertinent. R relates to the provision of broadband. Now, you might want to put it in, but it's not a regulation requirement unless it's a new build, okay? Because the objective is to try and use what you can of the existing building, however, making sure that only the fundamentals of safety are adhered to. So you can see that general means of escape, internal fire linings and structure are all taken care of. Fire spread for the external walls is relevant when it's over 15 meters in height. So if you've got a 2-story, 3-story, then you don't have to undertake an exercise of adhering to the external wall fire spread issue because it's really deemed as being low risk. However, if you look at Regulation 6.3, when you do a conversion to a change of use to let's say this office that happens to be over 18 meters, the external wall will need then to comply with the non-combustibility requirement, and that will apply to the whole of the wall. Okay, so it's different facets for different parts of the buildings. Yeah. And you want to know, but you will note that it does not include everything. For instance, acoustics for schools would obviously not apply. And we talked about staircases again. If you're not putting a new staircase in, then you can maintain what you've got there. Okay, so there is no requirement to change the staircases. So if you've got an office building that you convert in, you can leave the staircases as they are. In theory, it should already comply with the basics, the handrails and the nosings and that. But there will be some instances where offices are quite old that might not comply with that issue. And indeed, certainly historic buildings would certainly fall into that remit. So going through in terms of the actual requirements, so we need to look at the means of escape aspects from the converted flats. or conversion to flats. So that's within the within the flats themselves, the 9 meter rules, and also in the corridors and down the staircases and out. Yeah, so all that needs to be reviewed against the approved document B. Again, things like surface spread of linings. So if you've if you've got an office staircase that's got linings that perhaps are not Class O, then you'd be expected to take them off and replace them with Class O linings. Similarly with structure, you have to be a little careful with that. The requirement is such that if you have a building that is over 18 meters, then you might require an upgrade in the structure, especially when you're converting to flats. It might then need to be 90 minutes as opposed to 60 minutes. And it depends on what the original building was constructed of. And you need to do some investigation to ensure that the structure matches up with what's required in Part B. Talked about a bit about external fire spread and spread over roofs. Just be careful with the 15-meter issue. Again, you need to take account of the external fire spread. That's when it's over 15 meters, so it's one to another. Normally you get greater compartmentation and greater fire rating in flats than you would do, for instance, a typical office. And you need to be just aware of that. However, if you go over the 18 meters, then you will obviously need to think about the non-combustibility aspect. Part C, you need to be careful with the resistance to moisture, both in terms of contamination and the contamination in terms of how we deal with the ground floors and basements. And then acoustics, I'll leave it to my learned colleague Richard to do when we get to that part. And indeed, you obviously need to think about how we ventilate. So we must make sure that the air quality within our newly converted project does comply with Part F in terms of the air change rates, WCs, and having fans, and kitchens having the required extracts. It also includes interesting little issues, which are basically down to health and safety, really. So we need to make sure we've got adequate water supply, cold and hot. We need to make sure that the fittings we put in for the bathrooms are part of the efficiency drive. So we're looking to the fittings and the 105 litres per person per day. We need to control the hot water temperature, and we need to make sure that we do have provisions for wash and basins in bathrooms. It'd be silly to provide flats or dwellings without that. Part H, we obviously, if we're putting in bathrooms, then we need to make sure we can adequately drain them, and we also need to make sure that we get the required refuse storage, so that we don't pile up a lot of waste in the corridors. We have to make sure we got bin stores and we got the collection agency all geared up. Similarly, from a safety aspect, we've got Part J, which talks about boilers, making sure we get the right alarms if we got that in there, and making sure we get them certified in terms of gas and etc. And then one of the interesting ones for me is the inclusion of Part L. But just note, when it's a change of use, it is L1B. So there is no specific requirement to provide a SAP calculation. Neither do you have to formally provide that, although a lot of people do, because that's the mechanism to get the EPC. And in sometimes if it's a warranty, then you would need to do that. But from a building regs perspective, you are just moving down to the thermal requirements in terms of the overall U values for walls, and the services need to achieve minimum efficiencies. Part P is electrics, and the electrics obviously need to be safe and certified. So that's a key aspect of Part P for flats. And indeed, security, again, is the minimum standard of making sure it's past 24 for the doors and the surrounds around the doors, and indeed making sure that the first 4 windows that can easily be reached also have the locks on. So that's a broad brush approach. It is not the full approach to new builds, where it potentially is a little easier. So you have the ability to maneuver with just these being applied. Okay, so what I'll do now, I'll hand over to Rick to take us through some of the acoustic issues and which form part of these kind of considerations. Rick.
Okay, thanks Andy, and good morning everyone. So I've drawn together some of the acoustic considerations, as Andy says, for change of use. So despite falling under permitted development, before any works commence, prior approval may still be required from the local planning authority in relation to a number of technical matters. Firstly, we need to consider how noise and vibration impacts to current occupiers of the building, as well as adjoining owners and occupiers, will be controlled. And a report needs to be submitted to the local planning authority outlining this and the proposed construction working hours. Secondly, you need to consider whether there's noise from neighbouring commercial premises affecting the future residential units. In doing so, the developer must apply to the local planning authority for a determination as to whether prior approval is needed for it. And then that may have a bearing on the final item, compliance with the building regulations in relation to acoustic design of the units, and especially if adjoined to commercial premises. So the first item, the construction management plans, these are pretty much well-established requirements, typically prescribed by the local planning authority. And you usually get that information from their website. And you should include your expected hours of work. Obviously, these days, people are working at home more, so we can't really assume that neighbours are away at work all day. So we're expecting that noise disturbance complaints are likely to be increasing with people staying at home, exposed to noise from construction works at their neighbours' properties. And then obviously on the back of that, environmental health officers, we expect to tighten restrictions wherever they get the opportunity to do so. It's worth noting that noise and vibration measurements aren't often required for these types of works, given the short duration. Where we have had to do such measurements, it's typically been associated with basement excavations where there's more significant structural work going on. Secondly, going on to the neighbouring commercial premises. Obviously, this is quite a challenge, more a challenge in mixed-use areas, where you might be dealing with noise from restaurant and takeaway kitchen extract units, which might operate into the night time, and also adjoining uses. So they might have background or amplified music, or high impact activities such as gyms, and these can have significant disturbance to future residents if not dealt with. So we need to assess the potential impact and mitigate accordingly. That might take the form of looking at the airborne sound transmission from a nearby mechanical plant. So there you want to consider whether your glazing and ventilation specification is appropriate, whether that needs improving. Or you want to look at the sound transmission through adjoining walls and floors, in which case you'll need to do sound insulation tests to determine the performance of the existing partition and identify any potential sound flanking paths. This investigation might lead to need for remedial measures, improve existing constructions, or to mitigate those transmission paths. It's best to have a full understanding of this before you start any works, because retrofitting can be costly and obviously cause delays to the project. In terms of how we assess what a potential impact might be, the local planning authorities often quote a criterion of inaudibility when it comes to commercial noise. And in this case, you need to consider the different frequencies of sound being generated and how that might propagate into the building. It's particularly difficult if you're dealing with bassy amplified music, maybe at neighbouring bars or clubs, or if they're adjoining gyms with that offer exercise classes. So in terms of the building regulations, finally, approved document E defines sound insulation performance requirements for separating building elements and a requirement to achieve reasonable sound reverberation in common areas. It's critical to get input from the building control and agreement at the outset of the conversion to make sure, to confirm that it is a material change of use. As you can see from the table here, the performance criteria are less stringent for change of use, but we would always recommend aiming to achieve the higher specification to ensure build quality standards are maintained. So in terms of material change of use to resi, normally the biggest acoustic challenge is incorporating effective junction details, where you have new partitions, for example, and existing external walls and internal floors. As per the previous slide, it's best to undertake acoustic inspection and testing before works commence and identify current sound transmission and flanking paths. As again, retrofitting additional measures is likely to be more expensive and lead to abortive work. And with that, I hand back over to Andy to carry on talking about the other factors in the building regs.
Okay, thanks, Rick. I think the reality of the situation is that with the government pressing ahead with the relaxation, if you like, of the permitted development, it's important to note these considerations. The government are also very focused on quality of housing, which doesn't just mean new build. So there is a thrust to try and get that quality aspect in, but noting that there are very clear guidance in terms of regulations about what we are required to achieve, which doesn't mean to say that we have to achieve everything that a new build would in terms of the regulation aspect. However, as I said, it's something to consider. If you're building or converting offices to flats, why would you want to have a lesser standard, even if it's the lesser standard is a couple of dB reduction, which is allowed in building regs. So you just need to think carefully about obviously the market and what you're actually constructing or intending to construct. But the regulations are there to ensure the minimum standard. You can always go over it. Okay, so that was the bit about change of use, I think, and also some of it will flow into part of the other aspects of building works, which are outside the scope of, in theory, new build. One of which is material alteration. Okay, so material alteration is a complete definition on its own. When you alter a building, so when you knock out walls or you change things within inside buildings, then it is an alteration under Regulation 3. But the concept is, do not make the situation worse in terms of regulation than it was previously, which is not the same as upgrading because you've taken something out. Yeah. So, for instance, if you took out a partition and a fire door, and you put one back in, then in theory you can put it back to the same standard as it was originally put in. And we often see this conflict in terms of the old fire doors with the 1-inch stops, 25mm stops, as opposed to nowadays you'd be fitting with a much thinner stop, but with a intumescent seal to try and move that forward. Yeah. So you just need to be a little careful with the material alteration. The whole concept is to not to make the situation worse than it was previously. So if you've got a building, and it applies whatever type of building you're doing, an office or a flat, if you alter the works, the construction, then you just need to make sure you do not make it worse than in the majority of cases. Yeah, and that applies for structural safety, fire safety, and indeed disabled access. So don't make the situation worse than it was previously. Okay, so the third bit that I wanted to highlight on is probably obviously one of the keenest issues, I suppose, is how do we deal with extensions? And yeah, domestic extensions are relatively simple. However, how do we deal with blocks of flats, and how do we deal in specifically with where we want to put what we call airspace extensions on? So we're building above others, and obviously you can use this this analogy for all kinds of types of buildings. Generally, the extension itself has to fully comply with all the new requirements, A through to R. So they need to fully comply. However, the other bits of the building may not, and you may get a conglomeration of aspects. You may get an extension, which is built on the side, the back, the front, or on top, and you may get a conversion or change of use for perhaps an office to change some of the lower floors into residential. And then you may get a change of, a material alteration where you are reconfiguring the shops at ground floor. So you're going to get a mix of all those together to formulate your plans for redevelopment of a particular site or building. Yeah, and all of which comes with a different set of requirements. And it isn't a one brush will fit all. Yeah, so we just need to be a little careful on how we apply aspects and what we apply when. Yeah, the government have got some quite strong thoughts on that, but they need to be aware of what the requirements currently are. So in terms of an extension, the extension, perhaps let's say we've got a 3 or 4 story building, office building, and we put an extension on the top for a typical flat development. Then the extension would need to comply in its own right with all the requirements. Okay, and we need to be very careful with that, especially with the new introduction of sprinklers in residential buildings over 11 meters. Okay, so if your 5th story addition comes on, then you will be required to provide sprinklers in the new extension for sure. Okay, it does not though mean that you have to provide sprinklers throughout the rest of the building, although I guess a lot of fire departments and indeed building control may recommend that you provide it throughout, but sometimes that is not feasible. So we just need to think about what we do, and does the lower part of the building adversely affect the upper part. We need to think about the structural aspects and making sure that whatever we put above in terms of the extension doesn't add a disproportionate collapse aspect to the building. So if one of the members' columns or part of the floor collapses on the lower part, does that need to be strengthened? Does that need to be tied in? Because you've now added a extension on top of the building. Yeah, so we just need to be cognizant of that for the disproportionate collapse aspect. Means of escape and firefighting access, okay, is very key. So we need to make sure we can get people out, and we need to make sure we can get the fire brigade into the building. And if you're building extensions over various heights, 18 meters for certain, we'll need the consideration of a firefighting shaft and potentially a firefighting lift if it's over 18 meters. So we just need to be a little careful with that, and that obviously will bring some issues for the existing building that you are reviewing. So even if you build a block of flats 2-3 stories above office development that's currently there, then you will need to take account of the offices when you're looking at the firefighting shaft. So you need to be a little careful with the codes and how you apply that. The expectation is that the extension will fully comply. So if that means it's connected to the offices, then you need to think about how many staircases you've got. If it's a single staircase and you're connecting over more than 3-4 stories, then you need to think about what added protection you need to provide to stairs and lobbies, etc. One of the requirements under the change of use is to think about the external wall and the non-combustibility requirements. And clearly, if you build an extension which is over the 18 meters, then obviously that part of the wall would have to comply. But under the change of use, then you would also need to ensure that the rest of the wall complies with the non-combustibility requirements. It isn't simply acceptable just to cap it off and say, well, whatever's built below can stay, because that would have an adverse effect on the extension above. Thermal performance, and one of the interesting, the government, when they published a bit of guidance, they talked about this consequential improvement, although I'm not absolutely sure myself that this would be applicable. But we need to think about the square meterage. If it is over 1,000 square meters, then you may have to look at consequential improvements on the existing work, which would be an interesting concept to try and to implement, especially when you're potentially building an extension, but you're not doing much work to the existing building below. So some of the aspects that are very key, especially when you're talking about extensions above existing buildings and what's called over the airspace, you need to make sure the means of escape is correct. And the way to do that is to ensure that you comply as fully as you can with the requirements from ADB or the BS 991 or BS 9999. And if you can't, then you need to be looking at a fire engineered type solution. Travel distances are normally 9 meters, so typical developments in town centres, but where sort of the permitted development issue is targeted, you should be looking at the smaller end of flats. You can have staircases, but for duplexes, again, they should be protected staircases. You need obviously to make sure that the actual corridors themselves are fully protected, and where there's a requirement for ventilation, that you put them in either as a ventilated corridor for which is up to 7.5 meters with a natural vent solution. If you put sprinklers in the flats, then you can go up to 15 meters with a natural ventilation system. If you go outside of that and you go longer in terms of the corridor, then you are into mechanical ventilation, and you need to make sure that you adhere to the Smoke Control Association guide for the positioning of the vent, which needs to be at least 2/3 down the corridor, and indeed you make sure that all the equipment is in line with that guidance, with the necessary backup and power supply, etc. Need to think about the compartment walls, the fire rating. Obviously, if you take the building up higher, then you may fall in from 60 to 90, in which case you need to review the existing construction, and then you might need to justify the 60 or 90 minutes approach. External fire spread, as we talked about earlier, is very relevant for 15-meter plus buildings. Generally, though, if you're converting offices, then the fire protection and the compartmentation means that it's a lot less in terms of the external fire spread between buildings. And fire brigade access, very important, and we need to make sure we fully comply with the requirements in BS 9991, which then refer you to 991. So anything over 18 meters needs a full protected firefighting shaft with a lift. Okay, there are some techniques, engineering techniques you can use for larger open flats, such as CFD. You need to think about the positions of kitchens and where they lie in terms of the escape routes, and there is potential for radiation analysis. And you can do some more complicated requirements for fire spread, which rely upon the radiation calculations, all of which will need a fire engineer to assist you with. Suppression, very key. We talked about the new part of the construction, i.e. the extension, needing to have suppression. It can be sprinklers, but it can equally be water mist. And there are difficulties sometimes with tank sizes, and the water mist would be an added advantage. It also has the advantage of having less damage in terms of its water application. So there are some plus points cost-wise, though I'm told that they're probably equal. Again, we talked a little bit about firefighting, making sure we've got adequate fire brigade access, and just have a think about basements. If you develop a basement, then you need to think about getting people down there and smoke control, etc., etc. So again, it's well worth reviewing that in terms of either a change of use or whether it's part of the extension. Other aspects of building regulations, and we've talked through a lot of these, but just be careful with that. Obviously, if the extension has parts of it, then it's a higher standard than the change of use. We're obviously got to try and make sure we don't get water in the building. But some of the buildings can have breathable walls. We've got historic buildings that we've got to deal with, so we need to be a little careful with how we approach that. Ventilation is key. Obviously, want to make sure that buildings are constructed in line with the requirements of Part F, making sure we got purge vent so the windows can open. If you've got a problem with the windows opening because they're on the facade, then you're going to have to look at mechanical ventilation solutions, which can be quite tricky because they end up with bigger units, bigger ductwork, and obviously bigger risers, which are difficult to get into buildings, especially if they're existing scenarios. We need to do water use calculations. They are relatively simplistic now. There are tables that you can use, and you can just get the fittings off the contractor, and you can calculate those out. Pretty simple. And to make sure we can adequately drain to reasonable existing places of drainage, so we don't overload the sewers, and making sure that it can all be roddable throughout. Some other aspects of thermal performance. Again, for the extension, you will be using L1A, so you wouldn't need a SAP calculation for L1A. But if you're doing the change of use, then you are into this scenario of looking at the thermal performance of the fabric, which is a more simplistic issue. And again, it becomes more complicated if you want to deviate, and then you're using the SAP calculation itself as part of the methodology for the deviation when you're looking at change of use. So that is available to use, but again is more complicated scenario. Obviously, you've got to make sure that the fixed building services are relatively efficient, and they cover ventilation, the heating, the lighting, and potential for renewable energy if you're going down that avenue. Although, again, if it's not a planning issue, because you're doing a change of use, then you won't have a planning problem because there is no planning application for it. However, if you're building an extension, then you might be into the planning aspect, which is slightly different. Okay, so that's how we deal with the SAP calculations. And then finally, the requirement for security again is important. Making sure we get past 24 standard for the doors and the surrounds. Making sure we ensure we get the adequate robustness for surrounds of doors, and making sure we get the locking mechanisms right for doors and windows, especially when the windows are accessible. So that's really a rattle through a lot of the aspects that will apply for the change of use. Some of the aspects that look at the material alterations, and indeed the extensions, which I think is going to be the biggest challenge. And I guess a lot of the developments that we're seeing coming forward now, because of the permitted development, will allow a conglomeration of a lot of these issues. So you'll get them all on the same project. So it's not easy to navigate, and we just need to be cognizant of these very highlighted issues of fire safety, thermal performance, acoustics, security, and the like. Just a note there, though, that if you are thinking, why is the Part M not applied? Well, for dwellings, it doesn't. So you are not required to provide Part M compliant dwellings if you're doing a change of use. However, if you were building an extension, then the Part M would apply. So the extensions would need to apply with either M41, Category 1, Category 2, or Category 3. However, if you were converting the lower parts of the building into flats, then there is no requirement to undertake that. Okay, so it is quite a complicated aspect. The government are looking at that at the moment and are trying to get rid of the, or remove, should I say, not get rid of, remove the requirement for Category 1, which is what's called the visitable buildings. So that's an overview of where we are. Okay, thanks, Steve. I think we're just about there on terms of our timings.
Perfect timing. Thanks, Andy. So thanks for, to both of you, Andy and Rick. That was really good, and I hope the audience found the session useful. Just before we move on to the questions, just a really quick for people that aren't familiar with Bureau Veritas. So we're a global testing, inspection, and certification company operating in about 140 countries worldwide. From a building control perspective, we operate throughout England and Wales under our license, and operating in most sectors. We've got a wide range of additional services, including the CDM, fire engineering, and acoustic consultancy services. So we'll move on. We've had a few questions in. We had some around the sprinkler provision, so I think it may be worth just clarifying this, Andy. So clear on the extensions over 11 metres, that all seems to be quite fine. But in terms of a straight change of use, so we've got no extension, but the building is over 11 metres. So we may be going from office to residential. Can you just recap on the provision for sprinklers?
Yeah, in theory, it only applies to new build. So if you're building an extension to a block or building a new build block of flats, then the sprinkler is required, but not to a change of use. So it's quite clear the government have said they will reconsult on how they deal with the existing building stock in terms of the sprinkler issue. They would obviously like you to do it, but they can't force it. So it may be that you are ending up having to provide sprinklers to existing buildings under change of use if you are compensating for other aspects like the open flat layouts or indeed some other fire resistance issue that you might encounter. But generally speaking, you're not required to provide sprinklers in those under the new ADB, which comes out in November.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Andy. One for you, well, I've got a couple here for you, Rick. What if the building has listed status? So if it's a grade 2, I can't imagine many grade 1 change of uses, but grade 2.
Yeah, the building regs simply say, obviously, if not all these measures may be practical to improve sound insulation, what you've got to do there is improve the sound insulation as much as practicable in agreement with the local conservation officer. Often there's certain special characteristics of the building that you need to conserve that don't necessarily fit with some of the sound insulation mitigation strategies that you would normally apply to a new build or change of use building.
Yeah, okay, great. And then kind of like I suppose 2 questions in one really. In terms of the testing, the amount of testing that's required, and if we're going from a change of use, so can you just kind of like run through, kind of like the stages, at what point testing is needed, and are all, if we're going from office to flats, are all the flats required or not? Can you cover that?
Yeah, no. It is required in accordance with the regs to achieve compliance there, but as I talked about earlier, it's critical that there's these key phases in the works that you need to test the sound insulation performance of the existing building, look for weaknesses, and then obviously extensions, and once you've done conversion, pre-completion testing, but also intermediate stages as well when critical constructions have been installed or improved, such as walls and party floors, just to ensure that you are on track to achieving compliance. And in terms of numbers of the units to be tested, well, the building regs requires that you test subgroups of construction methods. Often when you, compared to new build, this is a bit more challenging because you are often dealing with existing constructions that might be highly variable across the building, with historic transmission paths that you have to deal with. So there might just be more testing than's needed for a new build, for instance. But generally, you look at what the proposed construction specifications are and group them into categories and just test those and assume they're the same across each one.
Can I just add on to that? It's an interesting concept about the sampling, which is not just for the acoustic testing, but also applies to air leakage testing. Noting that fact that you don't need an air leakage test for this type of change of use or material alterations. You only need it for new builds. The government, though, are looking very keen towards this this buildability issue and the quality aspect. So the future home standard, which is coming out hopefully in the next few weeks, which deals with the new homes, does talk about testing all new buildings, all new dwellings for air leakage, and we're expecting the same to be rolled through into the review of acoustics. But they are yet to determine whether that will apply to these kind of developments where we've got change of use. But I feel the government are going down a path of, yes, we've designed it, so go prove that you've built it to that design scenario. And yeah, it'd be wise to think about testing to that level of degree. So not a sample, but every flat gets tested from acoustics and air quality or air leakage, should I say. So whilst it's not here yet, expect it to happen over the next 12 to 18 months.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andy. Back to you then, Andy, for another one. In terms of, you talk about the non-combustible materials and extensions above 18 metres. Obviously, to reduce weight, etc., timber frame construction is being used more and more. In terms of encapsulating that in fire-resistant construction, what's the, can you expand upon that a bit more?
Well, certainly from the current stance from the MHCLG, the government, is that you can't build new construction over 18 metres with CLT that's within the external wall, because the external wall has to be a complete non-combustible element. Now, obviously, you can apply a full fire engineering technique to it, and that would be one way forward. But the current approved document guidance is that you don't have anything combustible within that wall. Yeah, so you can't put CLT, for instance, or a timber frame within that wall construction. It could be within it, so you could be sort of you could put the timber frame, if you like, inside the building and put an external wall out around it on the outside, and that might be one solution. When it's lower than 18 meters, though, that restriction isn't there. So you can deal with it by having that timber frame, but you need to, I think, from a mortgage aspect, just really consider what materials are going in there, and can you mitigate as much as you can. And again, a good fire engineering stance on the risk, and indeed the encapsulation aspect would be a way forward, I think. Certainly for 18 meters or less. It gets more complicated when you go over 18 meters because you are battling hard against the exact requirements, not only in the building regs, but also of the mortgage lenders that say you need to have an EW1 form that actually says that there's nothing combustible within that cavity, and that would include the frame.
Okay, that's good. This next one, I'm not sure if who can pick this one up. In terms of the process of establishing with a local planning authority whether approval is required, do either of you know, is it just a straight letter discussion with the planning authority, or is there a specific pro forma that needs to be done?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you, Steve. I mean, I guess pick the phone up to the local planning officer and discuss it with them in the first instance. The thrust is, though, from the government to reduce the red tape. Obviously, with a phone call, potentially it's not recorded. So, if any discussions you do have with the planners, it's certainly worth following up with a letter. But yeah, I think I'm not sure if there's anything formalised at the moment.
Okay,
Rick, I don't know if you've got any add to anything like that, Rick?
I haven't, to be honest, and I think that firmly sits in the realm of the planning consultants who will support you through that project.
So it's probably a letter or a telephone conversation and an 8-week wait. Anyway.
Yeah, which is what the drive is, to try and reduce the bureaucracy of the planning, because it's holding these projects up. And I've seen some interesting data back and forth, people saying there's no delay, and then the government saying, well, there is considerable delay and we need to reduce it and allow developments to happen and to develop quicker, so that we don't hold up the process.
Okay. So another one again, Andy, with your experience of change of use, so this is one from me really, this question, with your experience of change of use and extensions on top of existing, what would you say is the biggest hurdle or the biggest problem that you see on a regular basis when you're attending design team meetings and, you know, talking to architects? What do you see as the biggest hurdle?
Okay, I think the first aspect is that it's an appreciation of what actually is required. So, you know, a change of use is different from a new build, and an extension is different from a change of use. So you may get on a particular project a variety of change of use, material alteration, extension, and you may get perhaps even a new wing at the back. Yeah. So you might have on a typical development all of those issues to grapple with, and it's an understanding of what applies when. And what on the second bit then is to really drill into the fire safety aspect, because that's the key issue. So if you've got a building that's now got a floor over 11 meters, yeah, we all know that from the requirements that you're building these constructions, the new part has to comply, the new part has to have sprinklers, but then you need to evaluate exactly what is occurring on the floors below, and whether that's change of use to flats or whether it stays as it is, what effect that has on the upper levels. So you need to evaluate and assess exactly what the situation in terms of compliance is with the lower levels. So for instance, if you get a staircase, is the staircase lobbied? Are the doors protected properly? Even if you've got existing flats and you're building another extension over the top of them, you know, the doors can get pretty ropey over time. So you need to go back and address those kind of issues when you're undertaking the works to the extension, because otherwise it presents an adverse effect on the escape from the new upper levels. Yeah. So my advice is to always think about the fire safety carefully, and then to review exactly what you're doing with the existing buildings, whether you're converting it or whether you're leaving it as it is, and indeed what other aspects that you might need to consider in terms of upgrades to ensure you're not adversely affecting.
We are virtually out of time, so I'm conscious of time. So apologies for not being able to answer all of the questions during the session, but we will provide response to all of your questions in a follow-up email. We'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we'll send out CPD certificates. We'll also be sending out a link for you to fill out a couple of questions of feedback, and then you can download your certificate and keep that for your records. Again, thanks for taking your time to join us today. We hope you found it valuable. As previously stated, we'll share the recording along with the Q&A summary after this session. Thanks to Rick, thanks to Andy, and thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great day. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks.